Welcome back, Aaron Renn, to the podcast. So happy to have you. And David Stokes, our own expert on cities and counties and all things municipal. I appreciate you coming on, Aaron. There's been murmurings around St. Louis again on a topic that we have revisited for probably 100 years of should the city of St. Louis be a separate county from St. Louis County. Before we get to that, I want to ask you something because I was reading the news this morning, and I know that you've written about city-county mergers before, like cities that are kind of dying, then getting either pulling in parts of their closest suburbs to sort of make everything look better, uh, broaden their tax base, make their crime numbers look better. And I was reading something you wrote a year or two ago about that, and you said that Louisville is a failed example of that. Is that right? Basically?
Yeah, I'm a little skeptical of how these things have worked out in
Yeah, in terms of,
practice.
like, losing the flavor and the coolness of the city, and then literally this morning I saw an article about how Louisville's having a renaissance, and these young professionals are all moving there because they didn't, tear down all their beautiful old Victorian homes, so you can still get one for close to $1,000,000, and they've got a cool art scene and a bourbon scene, so it sounds like maybe Louisville did not lose its personal flavor in the merger, so I would be curious to know what you think of that.
Well, I like to put St. Louis in context. I'm glad you mentioned Louisville because many of these river cities have similar characteristics. And so I like to look at St. Louis as well as three cities in the Ohio, Louisville, Cincinnati, and Pittsburgh. All of them heavily German Catholic in their demographics. All of them are very geopolitically fragmented with many, many small, tiny suburbs throughout. They all have very fragmented neighborhood systems as well, where everybody has a strong sense of neighborhood identity. Where you go to high school is a big social marker. They
Certainly.
all have phenomenal collections of urban assets, great historic buildings. They all still have their own unique character in a country where that has sort of bled away. And they also have curiously underperformed demographically and economically in terms of growth. They're slow growth places. So one thing I always encourage people is to pan back the lens and don't just say, look at St. Louis in isolation. Look at it in sort of comparison or dialogue with some of these other places and see what can you learn from some of them. Louisville is actually a quite troubled city in important ways. Many of its corporate headquarters, from a white-collar employment perspective, it's doing well from a blue-collar. It's one of the 10 least educated major metros in the country. I don't want to spend too much time on Louisville, but I want to talk about the city-county merger, which is distinct from recombining the city and the county. This has been sort of considered urban planning best practice for 30, 40 years. There was a book written by the mayor of Albuquerque, something Rusk, called Cities Without Suburbs. And the idea is cities that were able to expand their boundaries through either annexation or city-county mergers were prospering, whilst like cities who did not, like the Clevelands, the Cincinnatis, and the St. Louises, were struggling. So the idea is we need big box government. And so Indianapolis, where I live now, had a city-county merger in 1970. Louisville did a city-county merger. I grew up near Louisville. Jacksonville, Florida, Lexington, Kentucky, Nashville, Tennessee, places like that. And what I would say is a few things. Not that merger is necessarily bad, but so for Indianapolis, merger did prevent the city from essentially going down the tubes in important ways. So it really was a win in important ways. But it did not prevent the historic city from going into the exact same demographic decline as St. Louis. The historic city of Indianapolis has lost almost exactly the same share of its population since 1970 as St. Louis has. Secondly, in order to generate, these are very politically difficult to pull off. They take enormous effort. They often fail multiple times. Louisville had multiple failures. So the most precious resource is always management time and attention. Is this where you want to put all your political chips? And in order to get it passed politically, what happens invariably is that most entities are actually not consolidated. So in Louisville, none of Louisville's existing incorporated suburban governments were, in fact, merged. And in Indianapolis, the school districts weren't merged. So this means you don't necessarily get all of the benefits that you think from consolidation because many things are excluded. And then unlike a corporate merger, where there's typically a lot of downsizing and cost rationalization, in city-county mergers or government mergers in general, nobody ever loses their job, and salaries and benefits might even be harmonized upward to the high water mark. So don't expect it to save any money. So I think personally, city-county merger might have some benefits for St. Louis. I'm not saying it would have no benefits, but it's not, in my opinion, going to be a needle mover there, and most likely extraordinarily politically difficult and uncertain to pull off.
Yeah, no question. It's been very politically difficult. People don't want to do it. However, we do have these like little teeny tiny school districts and police districts. We have, I don't know, 28 911 systems. We do have a lot of what looks like bureaucratic waste and red tape that seems like, to the extent that I guess that doesn't get resolved in a merger, then what's the point? But I do think that, we've been talking about the demographics of St. Louis. In the heyday, I think there was over 800,000 people in the city. Now there's maybe 280,000 and declining. And we're in the death spiral of more people dying than being born, for sure, and have been for a while. And I guess it brings up the question, like, what to do about that? What is St. Louis to do if we are in this death spiral? We're not having the babies. We're having, fewer babies than we did 15 years ago. So the school enrollment's only declining. What is the prescription in that situation? I mean, I've been to Cincinnati quite a bit. They're trying to get people downtown with sports stadiums. Doesn't really work. Louisville, they have the sports stadiums downtown. I don't know if people really want to move down there. I don't see it working in St. Louis. So what's a city in that situation to do?
It's going to be challenging in a sense because your problems are a little bit overdetermined, if you want to call it that. So St. Louis was once I would call it a sort of regional capital city, much like a Dallas or an Atlanta or a Denver or a Minneapolis. And, it lost a lot of those functions. Many of its headquarters have left. It used to have a lot of professional services firms like ad agencies that did business all over the country, not just for the Louisville market. Now St. Louis, although it's still bigger than in Indianapolis, looks a lot more like an Indianapolis or a Columbus, Ohio, where you have fewer corporate headquarters and most of the first services firms and things, they're just there to serve the local market. And so St. Louis has essentially shrunk a little bit in relative importance. And it's hard to get that back. The demographics are also quite difficult and, create the effect where it's hard to attract business when you when you have a shrinking labor force, basically. Weak demographic growth and a weak ability to bring people in from kind of the outside. So it's a very complicated situation, and I don't think there's any silver bullet
That's what
for
I'm
St.
asking you for.
Louis.
You have the answers. What's the silver bullet?
So
Right?
I will say this. Here's the things that I would look at if I were in St. Louis. One of the clear issues that affects all of these river cities is that their wonderful, unique local cultures come with a downside, which is an extreme parochialism that has, I think, two negative effects. One, it makes it difficult for the communities to cohesively work together, which I'm not telling you anything you don't
100%.
already know.
Yes.
City-suburb divides and that things tend to be bigger. In Indianapolis, regional leadership is mostly all on the same page, typically, about the big issues. Same with Columbus, Ohio. Secondly, it makes it very difficult to attract people from out of town
Yeah.
because they come there and they can't make friends. They can't penetrate the social networks.
Mhm.
You hear it over and over again in places like St. Louis, like Cleveland, even like Minneapolis, Minnesota. There's some sayings there. If you want to make friends in Minnesota, go to kindergarten because that's when everybody makes their friends. Or Minnesotans will give you directions anywhere but their house. right? They're never going to invite you over. St. Louis has that reputation. I don't think it's just a reputation. So I think the reality is, when you look at, I know you just had Ness Sandoval on, right? So he's
Yeah.
talking about you need to get better on migration. Migration isn't going to improve if migrants
Right.
are not going to be able to join the social networks here. And
Yeah.
that's not even like international, that's just domestic migrants.
Yes.
So I think that's a huge issue for the city. Cultural issues are hard to solve, but the other one, but you can, it's less maybe less intractable than infrastructure. The other thing is looking at sort of Pittsburgh as a sort of model where Pittsburgh hasn't solved really most of its problems by any means, but it has been able to regenerate in the city a sort of high-value economy around Carnegie Mellon and the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center that's done quite well. Many of the Silicon Valley firms have set up shop there. And what's happened in Pittsburgh, although it's still a demographic decline story, what has happened is there's been demographic transition in the city of Pittsburgh, which went from one of the least educated cities in America to now one of the youngest and most educated.
How did they do that?
Yeah, in St. Louis, well, part of it is old people moved and died off, and young, educated people replaced them. So the total number of the people in the city was declining, but what you didn't realize, there was a churn. And the same thing's already happening in St. Louis, which is to say, I think that the college degree attainment in the city is now well north of 40%. So the people who live in the city of St. Louis are very educated. And in this environment, population transformation, in a sense, in terms of demographic churn, has raised your educational attainment and thus incomes in the city a lot. Now, Pittsburgh was different because it was an almost entirely white city. There's a racial divide there, and I think gentrification concerns become more salient. Yep. But St. Louis is now an educated city. This is not a old post-industrial blue-collar city. The city of St. Louis itself is very educated. Also, being very small, it doesn't necessarily need a massive change to move the needle. In Indianapolis, we have a population of over 900,000. Moving that behemoth takes a lot. St. Louis, now being smaller, has a situation where you could actually make the city pretty. There could be a big impact from lower numbers of things. And so I think a sort of a knowledge economy built around Washington University and some of your medical, your medical. I think that there's possibilities there somewhat similar to a Pittsburgh, although they're not necessarily going to be quite as Carnegie, because of Carnegie Mellon's sort of engineering and computer science areas, is going to be a little different. I might, also look at, Vanderbilt. What's going on with Vanderbilt? What are some peer schools to WashU that you can see what's going on there? But I think there's actually some reasons to think that the city of St. Louis, believe it or not, could be sort of turning a corner in a sense, and that it's now demographically renewed itself to a higher educational attainment state. Being small, it probably doesn't have that much further to fall. And you can start building upward from there. Obviously, governance challenges, et cetera. But I think that looking at kind of the Pittsburghish model, studying some similar complexes around peer schools to WashU, and then the culture issues are where I'd look.
So as a spokesperson for St. Louis, David, what say you? What do you see for the future?
Well, I would be curious to get to Aaron know about that size question, about how the city of St. Louis has, in fact, gotten so small. I mean, it really has. It's about 10% of the metro area. And how does that perhaps affect the benefits, pros or cons of any type of a merger? And that this would not be really a merger of equals. I mean, St. Louis County would almost subsume sort of St. Louis City into it. And how do you think that would affect it, for better or worse?
Well, that was the critique of the Louisville merger by two academics at the University of Louisville. I mentioned the book Cities Without Suburbs. They wrote an academic paper called Suburbs Without a City, which basically said if merger passed in Louisville, it would essentially mean the suburbs take over the city, not that the cities take over the suburbs, because the old city of Louisville only had like 260,000 people in it. and the suburbs would numerically dominate. And the same thing would certainly happen in St. Louis. If there were a merger, not just the city rejoining the county, but you actually did a city-county merger, merged government, suburban, St. Louis County would control the city, in essence. So that's one consideration. Another one, this is a Cincinnati issue. I interviewed about 15 years ago the mayor of Cincinnati named John Cranley. And here's what he said. I think this is an important point. He's like, 30 years ago, city-county merger was the thing because the cities were in decline and you wanted to tap that suburban tax base to fund the city. But now it's reversed. Now the cities are coming back, and it's inner suburbs that are actually really going down the tubes or in a period of decline. And so in Cincinnati today, we have all the corporate headquarters, we have the universities and the medical centers, and we don't have to share our tax revenue with anybody. If we were merged with the county government, we'd have to prop up all these failing suburbs. And so I think you're in a similar situation in St. Louis, where the high-value activity is not all in the city of St. Louis because of Clayton and this and that, but probably St. Louis County suburbs are mostly places that themselves are on negative trajectories. And merging the city, which again may be on the cusp of being able to sort of bottom out and turn around, with all of these sort of still declining inner suburban areas, might actually be an albatross around the city's neck.
And I just think one of the differences between St. Louis, and I don't know the property tax base of Cincinnati, but so much of the city of St. Louis is tax exempt right now for their own fiscal part. Just so much of it between all of Washington University and St. Louis University and all the government. And I say that as somebody who sort of supports property tax changes to make them sort of pay something towards it. But I mean, I get what you're saying about Cincinnati. I just don't think that applies to the city of St. Louis right now. And that property tax exemption part is a huge part because the most growing, thriving part of it is the entire giant Barnes, WashU, Cortex complex, and the amount of property taxes they pay is minuscule.
Well, some of that is a planning issue. And I think the reality is when you have a complex like that, probably are all these people going to move to St. Charles? I don't know, but maybe not. I'll tell you, I live in the suburb of Indianapolis named Carmel. And a lot of the, of course, where I'm at is affluent, growing. And so a lot of the hospitals and things have been opening facilities up here. And when these nonprofit hospitals come up here, we will not approve zoning changes for those hospitals unless they agree to pay pilot, payment in lieu of taxes, for being nonprofit. It's like if you want to come up here and you want a zoning change, you're going to have to pay. And we were actually quite prescient in that one of the local hospital chains opened a for-profit hospital. And as part of the approval deal, we said, if you ever convert to nonprofit status, you will continue paying property taxes. And we did that. And so I think to some extent, there probably is leverage from the city over some of these people. Now, you don't have a lot of leverage maybe over a corporation deciding where to put their office, but that's not a tax exempt situation. Probably the stuff at Cortex is not going to leave if you make them pay a little money the next time they come to you for a zoning approval. I think you need to look, and I think you need to start looking at how do we get more money out of these entities that are essentially they're essentially nonprofits in name only. These universities and hospitals are effectively gigantic hedge funds, or, their executives are extremely well compensated. Billions of dollars are flowing through there. And so undoubtedly, the better solution there is to figure out how to tax them, rather than figure out how to tax the soon-to-be dead mall in the suburb over the border.
We do have earnings taxes, right?
Well,
so the folks who work there do.
Yeah, and that's sort of the trade-off, unfortunately, is that they do pay earnings tax. The employees, many of them very highly compensated, pay the earnings tax. And that's sort of that makes the city more dependent on local income taxes, not less, because they're either tax exempt or, in the case of like Cortex, maybe not purely tax exempt, but have tax abatements that make them essentially tax exempt.
Yeah, it's, again, I don't know exactly the fiscal architecture there. It's something to look at, but I would say, um, you don't wanna do a merger simply to do a tax dollar grab. I mean, I would think the lesson of Indianapolis is, we did that. We grabbed suburban tax dollars and we used it to rebuild our downtown successfully. But here we are 50 years later, and now we have enormous tracts of declining suburbia that are an enormous problem. Our entire core county is now, in a sense, the inner city, uh, and so we have big challenges because we were not able to invest in ways that allowed those suburban areas to retain their allure over the long term. And I'm not saying that's impossible, but any short-term juice you get, because cities always rise and fall. And the fact is, core cities have proven more resilient and more able to regenerate themselves than suburbs. Part of it is because state governments cannot afford to let their state's largest city or major urban center go down the tubes. Missouri cannot let St. Louis and Kansas City implode. Michigan can't just write off Detroit and say, who cares? You can't do that. But you can sort of these suburban areas have proven a lot tougher. So we don't have a good model too. We've spent decades thinking about how to rebuild cities and build districts, and there's certain things that you can pull off in a city around conventions, around sort of civic events, gathering spaces, museums, government, that are very hard to translate to suburban settings.
Yeah.
And so there's not a great playbook, especially in declining markets, for renewing suburbs. The playbook for sort of suburban renewal, if you want to call it that, is places like Carmel, Indiana, which are growing and affluent, and therefore can sort of build large mixed-use centers and new urbanist developments and trails and parks and all of that stuff. I mean, probably the suburbs of St. Louis County are tremendously deficient in infrastructure as we would understand it today. So, again, there may be actually benefits in having St. Louis City rejoin the county in a sense, because then the county functions are spread and amortized across a larger population. You don't want to have, again,
it would immediately improve our murder rate.
Yeah,
because
I mean, there's this sort of thing, like there is some of that, the murder rate, right? It's an artifact of the size of the city.
It
right?
sure is.
More than anything. There's places in Chicago with higher murder rates. There are places, a former colleague of mine at the Manhattan Institute, Raphael Mangual, he did an analysis of Chicago. He's like, look, there are areas on the south side of Chicago that are larger and have more people than St. Louis, with far higher murder rates than St. Louis.
Absolutely.
And so there is that sort of sense. Yeah. The other thing is, and Chicago's a good example. New York City was essentially a city-county merger. 98, the 5 counties that are the 5 boroughs of New York were consolidated into one city. Philadelphia was also a city-county consolidation from the 19th century. But what happens when you create a very large city of, say, 1 million people or more? You really have to scale up your government. You have to have a government that operates at whatever. And so what happened with Indianapolis was we merged city and county government, but we didn't really have a government that could effectively manage this new, larger territory. It never built out the infrastructure in the suburbs. It never built out. So like in New York, the Bronx has subways. It has great parks. Everything was built out with proper infrastructure because it was part of New York, and New York had to expand the governance to become a city of 8 million. You had to build a government that could run a city of 8 million. Chicago got big in the 19th century. It built a city government that could have a 3 million person city. And some of the stuff that's critiqued there, for example, is a lot of city services were organized by ward, or city council district. There's 50 city council districts, and every city councilor is sort of like a little bit of the mini mayor of their district. And
in Chicago?
Yeah, and that gets critiqued because the alderman controls zoning. It's called aldermanic privilege. So the alderman essentially has veto power over any zoning changes. There's a lot of constraints about that. But if it's just one mayor and one city council trying to think about a huge city of 77 neighborhoods and 3 million, 2.6 million people, they can't keep that much in their head. All they can think about is downtown. And so that's what happened in Indianapolis. The mayor and city council can really only think about downtown. We should have built out structures in townships or throughout the city so that you had leadership that was focused on that area, money that was focused on that area. That's what made the suburbs work really well. The suburbs, like Carmel, is basically township sized. Our suburbs are sort of township sized. We have 100,000 people, big enough to do things, but not so big that our mayor and council can't keep the whole city in their head and kind of plan and manage the whole city. So if you merge with the county government, you're going to have to create an entirely new government structure that allows you to essentially manage every sub area of that whole thing and bring it all up to a standard of services. That's the other thing they often did, like they do in Louisville and Nashville. They merge, but they have a 2-tier service system where they have an urban services district, which is for the old city, which gets more services, and then like the others that get less. They didn't do that in New York. There's one standard of service in New York, one standard of service in Philadelphia, one standard of service in Chicago. So if you can't commit to a single standard of service, you're basically creating like a bogus merger, in my opinion. If you're going to do a merger, you need to obliterate every government and entity in St. Louis County and city, merge them all into one standard. That's not going to happen.
And that's
not going to happen.
That's
not going to
happen. That's not going to happen.
So you end up with you end up with a lot of problems. Louisville's the same issue. Louisville didn't merge any fire departments, so they still have all their fire departments.
Yeah,
I mean, imagine a city that doesn't have a consolidated fire department. Like, isn't that like a basic thing? Like, imagine you have a city. Imagine you have a city without a single police department. That was actually Indianapolis. When we merged, the Indianapolis Police Department still patrolled the old city, but the new parts of the city that were consolidated in from the county were still controlled by the sheriff. So, like,
that's 100%. That is what would happen in St. Louis.
So you don't want that. That's what kind of a merger
and their
is
police
that?
Department and their fire department. I mean, I lived for a long time in Fairfax County, Virginia, which is a single county government. It's massive. 150,000 students, I think, in their school system. It's massive. It seems to function. Single police department, fire department. But I don't think you can backwards engineer that into a place that for hundreds of years has been operating as it's been operating.
See, Lexington, Kentucky worked pretty well because, one, the schools were already consolidated because in the South, it's typically county school districts.
Yeah.
Secondly, there were no other government entities. There's no township governments. There were no other incorporated municipalities, so it merged everything. And they're sort of able to solve the urban services district a little bit because, kind of the outer areas of Fayette County were horse farms.
Yeah,
and they actually put a kind of a green belt rule. You can't develop out there because they wanted to protect these scenic landscapes. And so there was actually a lot of people criticized that, but there was actually a good reason to prevent, why they wanted to treat that differently because it was a very unique American landscape. And so Lexington, I think, was pretty successful. Lexington was pretty successful and wasn't necessarily especially controversial when they did it, in part because there weren't all these entrenched interests like there are in a place. If there were difficulties here, and if you look at places that did the mergers, they weren't the Cincinnati's, Pittsburghs. They've been talking about consolidation in Pittsburgh forever. It was very hard in Louisville did it, but it was one of the least consolidated governments. In essence, the Louisville merger, what it did functionally is it dissolved the city of Louisville and reorganized county government. So
that's kind of
in
what
fact
would happen in St. Louis, right?
Yeah. So basically, that's sort of what happened. So the county government now has a mayor and a council instead of what the fiscal court, as they called it, with like the judge, executive, and all that. But that's essentially what they did. They basically dissolved the city and the county government was reorganized, but nothing was merged.
Did you have a question, Dave?
I wanted to get back to point out about the fire district point here. We're talking about why would this be so hard? There's actually a law in St. Louis that only applies in St. Louis County that makes it impossible to consolidate fire districts. Like even if a very modest, small, mid-sized suburb annexes an unincorporated part of the town, they're not allowed to provide fire services to that new annexed area. They can, but they have to pay so much to the old unincorporated fire district that it makes it impossible to do so. So, right, I mean, just one example of how even if you wanted a full-scale merger, and I don't want that, but even if you did, it would just be impossible to actually do it full through.
Why do you think people float this idea, David? Why do you think every couple of years the idea comes back up?
It's the old line. I remember a study I read about Pittsburgh and St. Louis many years ago, and the conclusion, and the question was, are the St. Louis and Pittsburgh areas really inefficient with all the fragmented government? And the conclusion was, well, you would never design a metro area like this, but they've sort of both made it work over the last century better than you would think. And the conclusion was they're not. St. Louis and Pittsburgh aren't actually as inefficient when you run the numbers as you might assume they are. And I think people have trouble accepting that. I think people look at so many small municipalities, many of them are dysfunctional. Many of them, until recent times, funded themselves primarily with traffic tickets, which is a terrible way to fund local government. And that's not even an exaggeration. And there's a lot of problems with it. And there's just this whole fundamental belief that if I can just plan it better, we'll create a better spot. And I just think it fails. And one of the reasons it would fail, and I say this, I'm talking the whole huge merger. There's all sorts of ways we can work together and share services and that. But one of the ways it would fail would be to get right back to what Aaron led this conversation off with, in that if St. Louis County and St. Louis City join together much more, they're not actually going to lay any government employees off to save any money. Like nobody in St. Louis City government is going to say, all right, well,
my work is done.
Time to fire
New York City
employees.
Large governments are not
it's
efficient,
never going to happen.
efficient.
So you're not going to save any money, and it's all just going to collapse.
Yeah, I think, I look at it and I say, look, I think merger is a solution for failed states, if you want to call them that, in the St. Louis suburbs. Take some microburb that's a complete scam or is bankrupt and kind of merge it in with its neighbor. Do some consolidation like that probably needs to be led by state government, almost like a receivership sort of thing. So it's just kind of like good government as you deal through it. But I just don't think that the benefits you would gain from trying to do like a complete governmental merger of St. Louis City with St. Louis County would outweigh the opportunity cost of how much time and effort you spend on it that you could be spending on other things that I think will move the needle more. And secondly, so that's number one. The downsides are arguably as high as the upsides. There's no guarantee it's even in that negative, even in that positive in this environment. The time to have merged was when Indianapolis did it in 1970, not in 2026. And then I think Nashville even did it in the 60s. Jacksonville did it a long time ago. And then I think, it doesn't fix the fundamental issues around the culture, which I think you got to kind of take a hard look at that and say,
and what do you mean?
Maybe impossible to change, but I
tell
think
me more about that. Yeah.
Well, just the idea that people who aren't from here have to be able to move here and get connected and feel like they belong in the city. And there's a couple we know who lived in St. Louis. The wife taught in St. Louis public schools. They're big kind of urban people. Husband was from St. Louis, and they moved here to Carmel, Indiana. Okay, so these are just people one of the spouses native from St. Louis. Basically man, people are just so much friendlier here. They make better eye contact. They engage more. It's just so much more welcoming here than it was even in St. Louis, even though we were actually in a sense connected because the husband was from there and we were. So I think there is, when even people who lived in St. Louis and liked it when they lived there, they didn't hate it. but they notice a difference when they leave. And that is a killer when you're already struggling demographically. I had a guy owned a business in Cleveland, and he said to me one time, he's like, I learned the hard way never to recruit anyone from out of town to work for my company unless that person or their spouse is from Cleveland, because otherwise they will never stay. And, when that's where you are as a place, that is just rough. And so, I think that is one of the killers for these river cities. But again, what is there? It is.
Yeah.
I do think it's
What's
a little
the fix for
curious.
that, right?
I just
I don't
look.
know.
I think the optimistic case for St. Louis, and I actually tweeted this like a year or two ago when I said, "Man, St. Louis City educational attainment is really high." Now, in a sense, it's a small, highly educated, probably is going to continue growing more educated city. So I think the Pittsburgh option looks
Yep.
viable in St. Louis.
And certainly great medical care. And I know that the average age is getting older in St. Louis. And I think within 10 years, 1 in 4 people will be over the age of 65. But we also have like an Alzheimer research center, and like access to medical care as you get older gets more important. And I do think that there's an opportunity to kind of lean in to the medical services that are available as the country as a whole gets older. I think St. Louis looks more attractive because for that reason only. So I think you're right. With universities and medical centers, there's an opportunity.
Yeah, I think if America's demographics keeps on this trend, a lot of other places are going to get to St. Louis.
That's right.
And I do think that the thing to be careful of is when you're in a declining market, that often prompts centralization of activity and population. So, in essence, what happened, Japan's population started falling, right? Japan hit demographic first. Everybody moves, basically moving to Tokyo. So it's
Yeah.
like Tokyo and a handful of other cities where everything is, and like literally they have ghost towns there.
Yeah.
I don't think it's any accident that Indianapolis's growth really took off once the sort of Rust Belt era and deindustrialization hit the state. Indianapolis and Columbus, Ohio have grown in large measure through sucking people out of the rest of the state as those states declined. Huge numbers of people move from Cleveland to Columbus every year. And so Missouri's a little different than that. So, you don't draw from the state. One of your challenges is St. Louis does not draw people from rural Missouri. I don't think it is. I should have pulled that data exactly, but like when I looked, it's not like there's a massive flow into St. Louis from the rest of
Now
the
there's public
state.
safety issues around that.
And
but
so
yes.
that becomes you don't have that sort of like siphon bringing people in. But we have the issue that we have is that we've now eaten our seed corn, and that there's not going to be next generations of children in the town I grew up in rural Indiana, in order to move to Indianapolis anymore. So the cohort sizes are going to be smaller. So that pump, even Tokyo, is declining now in population. That sort of siphon is draining the water table. So we can only rely on that so long. But I think this is the risk for St. Louis. In that kind of environment, people with an opportunity might avoid or flee St. Louis, and they'll go to where? Austin, Texas, Nashville. They go to the handful of places, the limited number of places in America that are really still growing, where opportunity is still happening. That's a threat. Even Indianapolis and Columbus, Ohio, that is a threat to us as well. And so, in a declining market, it's very hard in a sort of shrinking city to get people to want to come there because the opportunity space is shrinking. And that's never been the case. St. Louis opportunity space has been shrinking because you're losing corporate headquarters. You're losing that. Your working age population is not good. And so I think that dynamic is really going to be a challenge. But within that, the city of St. Louis might end up doing okay. Again, being small actually helps it here.
Any closing thoughts on that, David?
Just that, the part of Missouri that I think that definitely is still growing, that probably is attracting those young rural people who are moving to the city is going into Southwest Missouri, the Springfield, Branson area. Absolutely the growing part of the state. And even Kansas City is growing certainly more than St. Louis is.
Yeah, Missouri is, as you know, it's not a culturally cohesive state, and so it's yeah, and so I'd say Springfield, that area definitely growing, and growing despite the fact that they have nowhere close to the urban assets
Right.
of a St. Louis, and
Yeah.
so it does. It's interesting to watch, but
It is.
you just have to see what
I think
happens with
about it
that.
a lot, I see I've been talking about this in terms of school enrollment now for years and years, where you could see the biggest kindergarten cohort was after the Great Recession of 2009. So that that's the biggest kindergarten cohort for the last 15, 16, 17 years. You can just see where we're at. Like, we shouldn't build schools and hire teachers. We do nothing but. So we are slow to catch on to these things happening. But I think that your perspective is certainly very interesting on the sort of not worth the cost for the benefits, whatever benefits there might be on the merger. But it still gets talked about. So I appreciate you coming and giving us your thoughts on it. And maybe we'll have to have you back to talk about it again.
And
Okay,
Aaron, I want you
thank
to come
you.
back. I want you to come back because I want to find out how we get more roundabouts in Missouri. I love
I'd love to talk about
roundabouts.
that.
I
My
go to
favorite.
Carmel. It seems like once a year the past few years for these gigantic. I'm sure you're familiar with these gigantic youth sports tournaments up at Westfield, like just a little
Yep.
bit north of you. My kids' sports take me there, and I love the roundabouts. Like I cannot get enough of them.
I know, it's
They're
great.
awesome.
We hardly ever have to stop. I mean, there's barely any stop lights or stop signs left in our city. It's amazing. We're one of the few growing places in America where traffic's better today than it was 20 years ago. It's amazing.
Love it.
And people don't realize how good that is for air quality and everything. You just keep moving along, not stop, start. We need 100 times more roundabouts in Missouri.
Are you pretending that people stop at stop signs in St. Louis? Because let's be honest.
Well, they roll them, but it's
Who doesn't
still
stop
it's
at
great
stop
that they roll
signs?
'em, right. Right, maybe
Okay.
all the people
Hey,
blowing red lights on Kings Highway at 50 miles an hour are just being environmentally conscious.
that's
I need
exactly right.
I
That's
need to give
exactly
them
right.
more of the benefit of the doubt, I guess.
All right. Thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.